listeners, as you're on this journey to build your capacity and gain more awareness, what feelings have you found yourself having? And have you hit the pause button to reflect on, hey, why am I having this feeling? And then how does that feeling affect how we move forward? Join us today. Come on in.
I mean, Jody, these questions, they get us to being aware. And I love how you always set a bomb foundation. Before we hop into this conversation, though, I want to welcome into the house Monica Reinagel. Hey, girl.
It is great to be back with both of you today. I'm Monica Reinagel. I'm a nutritionist. I'm based in Baltimore, Maryland, and I'm the host of the Nutrition Diva podcast and the Change Academy podcast.
And we love your shows. Like, they're so amazing. And they fit right into the work that we're doing. So
they are heavily informed by the work that you do.
As we hop into this conversation, you know, the questions that Jody asked, I would love to just begin going down that journey with you. I know you've been on this journey for about 5 years. And so what feelings have bubbled up for you?
More feelings than I wanted to have on this topic. I will have to admit.
Right.
Yeah. So I met Jody 5 years ago at a conference when first became aware of her work, and the urgency of awareness was introduced to the upward facing and the downward facing triangles, and started to work with that concept. And as I shared the last time that we were talking, when we first got into that session, I was like, all right, give it to me. Let me pass the test. I just want to leave this conference having mastered this material. And it was really, I really had to get pulled up and be like, oh, this won't be finished this weekend, and this will not be finished this week. And so one feeling was a little bit disappointment, like, oh man, this is big, and this is hard, and this is more than I'm going to be able to just kind of unpack and, put a bow on and move on. This is going to be the work of a lifetime.
Absolutely.
So there was that kind of realization. I think that whenever we increase our awareness on something, or we see where we've been living without awareness, there can be some regret, some shame about wow, how could I have missed that?
Right. I should have known better.
Yes. Right. How could I have gotten that so wrong? Who have I unintentionally harmed through my lack of awareness?
Absolutely.
That's definitely a feeling.
That's good.
I think also for me, I'll just admit there was an impatience. Can we just get to the fix?
Yes.
How can we just make this right so that we can, get past this? Because it's uncomfortable.
I like what you said, get past it. Not through it, not process it.
Get over it. Right. I want this in the rear view mirror.
Get to the deliverables.
Because it is very uncomfortable to be confronted with the reality that we've been operating from a certain position that not everyone is, operating from, that we have enjoyed privilege throughout our lives, that we did not acknowledge, did not realize the impact of that on us, on others. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah. And listeners, as you hear Monica, does that resonate for the feelings that you've had? And as we think about the feelings we have, why are those the feelings that we have? Because one of the things we've talked about and I've noticed is if you hold a lot of normalized dominant identities, sometimes that evokes different feelings on the awareness journey than if you hold a lot of identities that aren't normalized dominant. And I'm dealing with patterns. It's not always an absolute. But I hear that a lot from people who hold a lot of normalized dominant triangles is the two things you said is, oh, I feel bad. There's shame. Or in Minnesota, because we're Minnesotans, oh, I feel guilty. I didn't know.
Yeah.
And so that shame piece. And then that piece of I want it to be a to-do item on a checklist. It's never said that way, but if it could just be a to-do item
No,
on a
I
checklist.
say that exactly like this. Give me the checklist. Give me the to-do list.
Right.
Give me the best practices.
So that I can check it off.
Right.
And I can incorporate it and keep moving.
And so that I can know I'm doing it right.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That's my goal in life. Am I doing it right? Yeah.
So for audience, why do you think that those feelings are often evoked with folks who have normalized dominant identities? What is going on there? And as we process for yourself, what do you find, or what do you think that's some of why you have some of those feelings?
Well, I guess it comes from, I think, a perspective of saying like, look, if you just tell me what the rules are and I follow the rules, then I'm good, right?
Yeah, and I'm going to now, that's deep, because I'm going to take that back to the normalized dominant societal system. If you hold normalized dominant identities, then remember the societal system has been geared towards you. So the rules have been geared towards you.
Right.
And so you have unintentionally learned, well, rules are good, or if I follow the rules, it will lead to good things.
Right.
And just go back to the very first episode where we talked about right-handed, left-handed, and we normalize right-handed. And so all the equipment on a construction site is geared for right-handed. So if I just make the cut the way they taught me in shop, which was probably by a right-handed instructor, then it'll be good. But because I'm showing up with this different identity, that's not true. And so a lot of times when you don't hold the normalized dominant identity, the rules don't fit. In fact, they can harm you, or not at the very least they don't fit, and you have to adjust, or in the very most the rules can be very harmful.
Yeah, I definitely, like, as I was listening to you, from my experience, it's like rules schmools. Like, I hear you. And
we gotta get a sweatshirt with that on. There you go.
Right, because the rules have not, been in my favor. There have been some rules that are not in my favor. And so having to navigate, okay, which ones, how do I show up? Right?
How important is it to me to follow those rules?
To follow this one or that one, right? And so that was really cool how my mind was like, that's interesting, because it makes sense because that's your lived experience. Right.
And it makes sense because that's your lived experience.
Exactly.
And so listeners, this is a great example of how the lived experience then, normalized dominant, not always normalized dominant, can lead to feeling differently with awareness.
The same set of facts. And, when we're talking about rules and you're like, right, if you are the person for whom the rules were designed, if you are the person who has the ability to follow the rules, you have a different relationship to rules. But how often when you have been doing this work, which I know you have done in countless different kinds of communities, have you had somebody get their back up and say like, oh, now you're going to change the rules on me? Has that ever come up?
Yeah, I always say the most tension happens when I say the rubber hits the road. And that's when we actually start to talk about policy change and we start to talk about changing the rules. And I'll have people say, two things that will often come up is, it's a free-for-all now. Because we're lowering expectations. So when we change the rules to maybe broaden, people sometimes interpret that as lowering the expectations. And it's like, well, let's talk. And I always I embrace that. Let's talk about this. Are we lowering the expectation, or are we changing the rules so that it'll work for more? Because unintentionally, we sometimes can change a policy and lower expectations. So let's have that conversation. But for a lot of normalized dominant, changing the rule will feel like we're lowering expectations rather than just making the expectation broader to include more, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. I was actually thinking of another example of this. So I'm thinking of the Me Too movement that came up, where women started speaking up and saying like, okay, it's not okay for you to pat me on the butt when I walk by your desk. Not okay, and it's not okay for you to ask me to go out for drinks with you. And, all of the workplace stuff that was really brought up. And I heard a lot of men in the workplace saying like, okay, you guys are changing the rules because this used to be okay. Now this is not okay. And now I'm in trouble, not because I'm breaking a rule that is a new rule that, that I wasn't aware of. So, so how does that fit into that framework?
I want to just hop in here real quick, because that's a great example, because that was created by a Black woman who was taken over by a white woman. And then once white women got on board, it blew up, right? And so it's really cool how, like, when we think about the rules again, right? Like how when the Black woman was saying Me Too, how it had to have the affirmation or the confirmation of white women to then get some traction.
Absolutely.
That was a good example. That was good.
Well, yeah, even within a movement, the more normalized dominant that signs up for the movement, then all of a sudden the more it gets seen and heard.
The more it's valued.
Right? Yeah, seen, heard, and then valued. Absolutely.
That was
absolutely. Yes. And so in that example, what I hear more of is, you're changing the rules, is again the drive to want to adhere to rules.
Yes.
And now that you changed them, I might not be able to adhere to it, which would make me quote unquote wrong and then quote unquote bad. how a slippery slope that starts.
Yes.
And so what I would with that group would say, well, rules change all the time. So this rule change, what is it evoking for you? And I would want to help that participant start to process what's going on for them. Like with the rule change, what feelings are you having? What are you afraid of or not afraid of, or what's being evoked? Because throughout my life, rules have changed, and so
it's that uncomfortable space. What I'm hearing is that is one of the feelings, right? The shame, the harm, and the uncomfortableness that the men felt from the Me Too movement, for example, right? For having to do something different, knowing it was right.
Yes. And I think that's another feeling that comes up that we've talked about is uncomfortability.
Well, sure. The discomfort of feeling like, oh, I'm wrong. And that's very unfamiliar and therefore very uncomfortable. Yeah. So, how do we make this right in a hurry so that I can feel,
so I can move, keep going, good, so I can keep operating ultimately, so I can keep playing in my tool or my sandbox and keep operating the way I'm operating.
Yeah.
Which moves us into the urgency to resolve, right?
Yes.
Like try to figure it out real quick, even though we
just
need time
tell me
to
what to
really
do.
figure it out.
Right.
Yeah.
Just tell me what to do to fix this so that I don't have to sit here feeling like I've done somebody wrong, even if it wasn't my intention. If that was my impact, then I just need to fix this so that everybody can feel better.
So what I hear us saying is that there are going to be feelings at every part of this journey. So when we get information that brings us new awareness of something we haven't thought about or seen, that sometimes we feel bad, like how could I not have seen that, which sometimes it leads to shame or guilt because of Minnesota. And then sometimes if we don't hit that pause button and process it, we feel uncomfortable. And how we want to get out of that uncomfortability is, well, let's hurry up and resolve it, right? And then you continue on the awareness journey when new action is being put in place because people have gained more awareness, like the Me Too movement. There's a whole nother time of having feelings of frustration, like, hey, wait a minute, you're now telling me I have to show up to work differently or I have to behave differently. You guys are moving the goalpost, which sometimes evokes fear or it evokes frustration because now things all of a sudden feel unfair, right? So at every part, listener, at every part of this journey of awareness and building our capacity, there's going to be these feelings, which we've given tools about how to hit the pause button, and in season 1, the last episode, how to process those feelings. But today, to talk about why do we have those feelings? Because a lot of times if I name the feeling, that helps normalize it. But if I understand why I'm having it, then I can let it go. Because there are, like you two demonstrated, there are different feelings with different identities. And so if you're normalized dominant on the journey of awareness, there's a pattern of some different feelings coming out than if you're not normalized dominant. And why do you think we have those? And so I'm interested, Monica, for yourself, if as you've been on this journey and you've been very aware of your feelings, have you made that connection as to why you've had it sometimes, those patterns?
Yeah, I guess sometimes I have been able to, kind of get curious about, well, where is that coming from? Which does require that we sort of release our judgment about the feeling, right?
Absolutely.
We can't really get curious if we're feeling like the feeling that we're having is good or bad or appropriate or inappropriate. So,
which is ironic you said that, because in the tool that I referenced, step 2 is saying it's okay to have that feeling.
Right.
So if I feel shame, it's like
That's
naming
so
the feeling. And then step 2 is saying it's okay to have it. And I love that you said this, because you just emphasize how important that step 2 is in that tool. Right. If we don't say, no, it's really okay to have this feeling.
Now
we can be curious.
Then we can be curious.
Yes. Otherwise, we're still going to operate out of, and we'll beat ourselves up.
Right.
Absolutely.
I love that.
Right.
Yeah.
Which leads nowhere.
Right.
It doesn't lead to insight.
It leads to me on the couch eating a bag of chips for 3 days. That's what it leads to. Right.
So some of the things when I've managed to do that, and I don't manage it every time, but when I have managed to do that, some of the things that I've found hidden in there, one of them was that I have this idea of who I am. And
come on, Monica, talk about it.
Right. And I have this identity that I've bought into. I don't mean normalized identity. Yes. I mean this identity that, like, I'm kind. Yes. I'm caring. I'm generous. I see people, like all of these things that I want to believe describe who I am. And so sometimes those strong feelings are being confronted with awareness that calls that identity into question.
Yes, that's
You
it.
know?
That's it.
So it's that disconnect or that tension between who I might have been and who I want to believe that I am, you know,
Yeah.
and that.
And I'm going to use our tool on you, the
Where
both
did you find
and,
her?
right? In Baltimore, you know.
Be more.
But and going back to the tool again, that is both and. You are kind, you are generous, you do see people, and you have identities that are normalized dominant in a societal system that hasn't required you to see everybody.
That's it.
You know, and as you learn to see and understand more experiences, you still bring your kindness. So, you know, get out of that either or. Either or. But I love that, listeners, how many of us, we see ourselves one way, but then on this journey of awareness, we're like, oh,
that's me too.
yes.
That's me too.
And are we accepting that that is me too, and not making that, oh, this...
It's not bad. Like you're saying, not making it bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that some of the why, when some of that discomfort comes up, is that, you know, dissonance.
Absolutely.
So for you, the uncomfortability is getting information that contradicts the picture of yourself.
Yes.
And now you're uncomfortable. And a lot of us, when we get uncomfortable, we'd rather just move on, which is we could move to action, or we can just shelf it, or we move on in different ways.
Yeah.
So to sit in that uncomfortability is much
the
more
work.
That's the
That's
work.
the work.
Yeah.
And I want to just point on that one of the differences I find is the more normalized dominant identity the person has, sometimes the harder it is to be uncomfortable. And I think that's because the system has always been geared, you know, as a right-handed person, it's always been geared to me. I wasn't aware of it. My friend gets that one place that's geared for left-handed people. I went there twice. You know, I mean, I'm like, I'm not going to be bothered with this. I'm not going to adjust, you know, so I was so not able to be uncomfortable.
Well, I think, you know, I love that example. And just for our audience members who need to go back and watch that episode, I loved how you said, like, she was a left-handed woman who created her space to accommodate her. So when you walked into the space, you're like, man, this is some craziness. Meet me at the coffee shop
where stuff works for me.
Because I don't want to do this.
Because I don't, so I didn't want to be aware. I didn't want to process no feelings. And that was all about, I was uncomfortable.
Exactly.
And so the more we have normalized dominant identities, just our lived experience hasn't always forced us to be uncomfortable or aware. And so I hear that a lot but when I work with audience that hold a lot of identities that aren't normalized dominant, they're like, shoot, I'm uncomfortable every day.
All day.
I'm adjusting all day. Right there. you said it. I felt it. Right. And so, Monica, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking about your question about, you know, when are we able to identify the why behind
why
it?
we're having these feelings. Yeah.
Another thing that came, and we've talked about this before, it has to do with that urgency to take action. Like, can we just get to a solution here? And you once said something about that being a very European trait.
Yeah.
You know,
let me explain, and you've helped me clarify. So audience, I've learned from Monica, because I say, a lot of times when normalized dominant folks, or folks who hold a lot of normalized dominant identities, want to take action, it's about themselves and alleviating their feeling. And you said, when I say that, sometimes you're like, that makes me feel bad, or I feel like I'm,
doing it wrong.
Yeah, doing it wrong. And I'm like, oh, I'm not saying that taking action is bad. And this is why we're having this episode. Why am I having that feeling so that I can release it, so that the action I take isn't about me? And what I find is that a lot of times on this journey of awareness, we don't hit the pause button at every stage we're having feelings and process that why. And so all of a sudden, oh my gosh, Nita, I didn't know that was happening for you as a Black woman. It's evoking guilt or evoking whatever. So I'm like, well, I'll get it fixed for you.
Right.
Well, the reason I want to get it fixed is so that I don't have to sit in the feeling, which makes me uncomfortable, because as a normalized dominant person, I might not be okay being uncomfortable. Yeah. And I have been, maybe as we talk, nurtured to fix things.
Yeah, totally socialized that, like, part of my role in the world is to, you know, fix stuff. Yes. Right. And I think that comes from growing up. So my dad was an engineer, and this is a very engineering worldview. You know, my dad sees the world as a set of problems to be solved. Right. Yeah. And so you grow up that way and you absorb that way of thinking. You know, you see a problem, you analyze it, and you come up with a solution, and then you just move on to the next problem. Right. So it's definitely, for me, it's both. It's both and, Jody. So for me, I do have that training and that worldview of like problems are to be solved, you know?
And fixed.
And they can be. Right.
And
Which is right there, sort of a privileged point of view, you know? Like,
Absolutely.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Because there's a lot of identities who are dealing with problems for years and years and years.
Right. Without the tools to fix them.
Without, the powers.
So it's both that, just that kind of worldview that I absorbed from my dad, and I love my dad.
Absolutely. They only knew what they knew.
Right. And definitely just discomfort of having things not be right, having it maybe be my fault, even if I didn't intend any harm, and wanting to move through that discomfort. And what I love that you said is that when we're in such a hurry to get past that discomfort, the action that we take may not be the most skillful, the most appropriate, the most,
Well, and I'll use our terminology,
Yeah.
may not lead to building capacity. And it might actually diminish it because the action, if I take action too fast, too soon, I'm using you, Nita, on a black woman issue, it's taken my blanket of life, putting it on top of her, smothers her out. It's like
James Brown.
Right. Then you use your James Brown. And so then all of a sudden people are like, hey, I didn't ask you to do that. I'd rather you just sit and be present and listen and hold that uncomfortability. And then together we can make that move forward. And I want to point, the reason you had told me that you have a father who's an engineer. And so you're like, I have that fix-it mentality. And I had said, well, that's a normalized dominant mentality. In our normalized dominant societal system, one of the things that's normalized dominant in America is European ethnicity, which tends to be about linear, and it tends to be about, isolating, like you said, a problem. Whereas if you grow up in other cultures, other ethnicities, like I said, I work a lot with different First Nations, and there it isn't about isolating a problem. And in fact, if something disrupts what's happening, that's the time to sit and watch everything. Well, where is this? Okay, the disruption is happening here, but let's sit and be quiet. Let's look at the entire system and what is occurring for this disruption to happen. It's not, let's find the disruption, isolate it, and fix it. It is much more systemic interconnectedness and a time to actually sit and be quiet.
This is one of my favorite pieces of awareness that you've brought to me, because I didn't recognize until you kind of showed me a different way how firmly I would respond in that first way. Here's a disruption. Let's figure out what's causing this disruption and fix it.
And go ahead. I don't want to stop your wisdom. Go ahead.
No, I love this idea of like, what is this disruption telling us about this entire system that we need to understand before we go to fix that? That's really been a paradigm shift for me. Sorry.
No, this is good. I mean, and what I'm hearing from my perspective is layers. Right? Because you're saying that it's your father who, like as you were raised in the household. And then when you think about going to school, right? So as children, we learn from our parents. In the household, we learn from our parents. And then we all go into this environment that is built for white children, right? The whole culture, we learn all of your culture. Nobody else's culture is primary in there. And so also y'all fix it from kindergarten all the way through your senior year. Right? Then you come out into the world thinking that that's the way it's supposed to be. And then that's where a lot of the blind side is, because people are like, we're grown now. And no, we're not doing that. Right? But now we're all having to unpack 12, 13 years of education on top of our individual environments at home and our parents, so there's layers to why we get to thinking that we're fixing things, not just from our parents, but also from the environments.
Right. And so when I hear you talk, it's for listeners, the house you grew up in, was it normalized dominant? Was it not normalized dominant? Because that affected us. And then as we talk, our institutions are often normalized dominant. And so if you went to a school that was not intentionally trying to operate differently,
which is 99.9% of the schools
are normalized dominant, right? Then that reinforces
exactly,
and then all of a sudden, no kids.
Now you're in a corporation,
right? That reinforces,
right?
And so the
or
whole, all the reinforcement, and that's what I hear you say is, hey, I've always been rewarded if I can fix a problem. Yep. I get rewarded for being effective, efficient, and move forward. And so what I also hear for listeners, this should give us a lot of grace. we've been embedded in a normalized dominant societal system our whole life. And some of us, our families have reinforced that. Sometimes we've gone to institutions that have reinforced that. So of course we would have feelings of, oh, I don't want to feel uncomfortable because I didn't have to. Or of course we might have feelings of shame. And if we can understand why we're having those feelings, it can allow us to process them.
Yeah. I like that word, blind spot. We don't beat ourselves up for the fact that there's a spot behind our car that we can't see, but we have to take it into account when we are changing lanes or, whatever.
And I want us to take it into account with each other. So this is the big requirement. Is I can show myself grace when I have feelings come up that I don't like, but I don't always give other people grace. So when those white men show up and they're frustrated because of the Me Too movement and they're like, well, what, you can't just change the rules. Am I showing the same grace to them? Because again, they've just been through everything we just talked about. They may have grown up in a normalized dominant household, in normalized dominant institutions that have helped them get to this place. So am I reacting to them because of the feeling they're having? So I'm not showing them grace. Or can I gain and build my capacity, and ultimately that's what I try to do, is build my capacity large enough that I can hold that space and say, yes, it does sound frustrating when last week you walked in and you could make this joke and this week you're hearing that you can't. There is frustration. The goalpost looks like it's moved, and help that person process that feeling and why they're having that feelings, so that ultimately then also to say, and now how might it feel to be a woman who's had to endure this? So that, but we can't get that. A lot of times I see when people are having feelings of frustration, or they're having feelings of shame, or they're thinking something is unfair, we don't hold that space and show them grace. So when these feelings come up, we want to understand the why, and then we want to show ourselves grace to allow ourselves to understand the why. But then are we showing up when we go to work and in our families, when people are having their feelings, are we showing up and showing grace there? Because I think that's a lot harder.
One of the ways that we talk about it in Project Even with the girls, Project International with the girls, is we call it, I outlined it with like, we all are at developmental spaces, right? We're all at different developmental spaces. And so it's
every day, all day, at every moment.
Right.
Yes.
And so when we talk about giving grace, it's because when we can identify that, we're working on us, right? So we understand where our developmental spaces are, and someone may not be there just yet. Then it's like, you know what? I can't even be mad at you. You know what I'm saying? Because I was once there.
Exactly.
And so it makes it for us, and as we walk these girls into adulthood, being better, it just gives them that framework to be okay with it.
That freedom too. That's my thing is, like you said, this is a lifelong journey. There's not an end, right? And I need grace. I still, there are stuff that'll be said to me that I'm like, man, I just operated out of a normalized dominant experience. How did I miss that? So I need that person that showed me that to show me some grace, so I can process the feeling.
Right?
Process the feeling, understand why. And understand why I'm having that feeling, so that I can build my capacity and then re-engage with that person and say, hey, but then do I demonstrate that grace to others? Because I love that, like you said, you're teaching the girls that we're all at different development. So the way I want someone to show up for me on my worst day, am I going to show up that way for someone else on their worst day?
And that's when you know if you're doing the work.
That's when you know if you're building your capacity.
When you know if you're building your capacity. Exactly.
Right. I think what I will take away from our conversation today we talked about it's important to stop and get curious about the why. But what I really want to take away from this when I'm dealing with other people is to remember there's always a why. For whatever is being displayed to me, whatever I'm triggered by or reacting to, I need to remind myself there's a why.
Yep. And that's their stuff.
That's
theirs.
But there's a why. And that just helps me kind of open that space and to have that grace for myself, for others. Like there's always a why.
Yeah. Well, that's
this
a
feeling
huge
is coming up.
Tool. There's always a why. And then am I going to react to it? Or am I going to hit the pause button?
Am I going to give them the grace in that moment?
Yeah. Am I going to hit the pause button and process my own feelings that that I'm having
because
because
that's
of that.
again, that's us saying, okay, where am I?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So have I developed in this space or no?
Am I going to hit
right?
that pause? Yeah.
When you give them the grace, when you give them that grace, baby, you
right.
like, who ain't grown?
Yes.
Yes. Who
I got
ain't
some
grown?
capacity, capital B and capital
Yes.
C. Right. And then I want to bring it to, because when we do this, when we first of all name that the awareness journey has feelings at every turn. You know, there's every turn of it. When we first become aware, there's feelings. When we want to take action, there's feelings. And we start to understand why we're having the feelings we are having. And then lastly, we've built up so much capacity that we're allowing other people to have their feelings, and we're holding the space and showing the grace. Then ultimately what can happen is now we can take action in a way that we would not have taken it before. And one of the things I love is you do this at Project Diva is, instead of having allies, talk to us about that, because this is, I think that in cases what can happen if we're on this journey, becoming aware, processes our feelings, understanding why it's happening, and showing up with grace, then the action you ask out of people is what?
Most of the times, because we're doing our work in our community, within the organization with both the girls and the women, we are already doing the work. So we don't need allies, right? Because most allies live in that developmental space that they need to save. They need to fix it. And so we would rather have accomplices who are willing to do the work with us, because like you said, once everybody's doing their work, now we can come together and then decide what the solutions could potentially be. You know, getting all perspectives to be able to make educated decisions as we both move forward and into the resolve.
So you don't want allies, you want what?
Accomplices.
Yes.
You know,
which
I want you to ride with
that's
me.
What I said. That's what I was.
We Bonnie and Clyde or
girl,
not?
that was my line. I was like, you want to ride or die. You want someone who's going to really be in it with you.
Exactly.
And if you haven't,
no matter if the stakes are high or not.
Right. And if you haven't processed your feelings and you haven't understood where your feelings are coming from, you're going to actually do more harm than good. You're not going to be able to ride and die with us. The first time things get uncomfortable, you're going to bail. Yes. And so, dang, that was deep. That is deep. And that we're going to do a whole episode on the difference between allyship, yes, and being a ride and die accomplice. Yes. But it requires a lot out of us.
It requires work. It requires us to push the pause button a lot of times.
Push the pause button.
A lot of times. And give
feel
yourself some
feelings.
Capacity.
And then I think the big one is then extend that grace to other folks, which becomes difficult sometimes.
Exactly.
Yes. This has been so rich. I thank you for coming on and sharing, and of course Nita for all the work that you Nita, you live in this workout every day, so thank you.
We all are, sis.
Yes.
We all are. Well, I mean, that brings us to another close. Oh, I told you at the beginning this was gonna be juicy, right? And so this is what the work looks like. Right? It's us building capacity individually, in our community, and in our institutions. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you chose to hang out with us, and we so appreciate you for it. Now, what I'm going to tell you is build that capacity, and until soon.